All right, do we have everybody here? Good morning, Summer Institute students. So I'm going to have two requests out the back here. Anybody want to take a guess at what the first one is? Put your cell phones away. Number two, laptops, except for Dr. Pitts here. He gets to keep his laptop out. So please put the laptops away. Right? I think tomorrow I'm going to encourage everybody to sit in the front row because I'm going to start calling the front row out first for food. So think about that when you sit in the back row there. If you want to have dibs on the sandwiches, sit in the front row. So think about that for tomorrow. Okay. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Pitts from MIT Lincoln Laboratory. He's been working at the lab for a number of years, bounced around to several groups. I'll let him talk more about his background better than I can, but obviously he's going to talk to you about advanced technology for disaster applications. And I hope as you guys think about this and see his charts, you think about how the sensors and the analytics and the work that you're doing right now has applications in this mission space. It's very important. Anyway, thank you, and here you go, Jonathan.
Thank you. So what I really want to say is take all your cell phones out again. Undo what Joel just told you to do. So again, my name is John, and I've worked at Lincoln Laboratory for about 16 years now. I've done a bunch of different things there, but most recently, I've moved into a group that does technology development for supporting humanitarian assistance missions and during disasters or just after disasters, trying to advance the way the country and really the world can respond to what are some pretty awful situations. So I think I'd like to start by asking, is anybody here from the Gulf Coast or from Florida or from the Caribbean or any other of the vulnerable places around the world where disasters often hit? We've got some hands. Who's lived through a hurricane? All right, there's more. So big snowstorms count, right? All right. So that's this chart, right? There are all kinds of disasters, natural and man-made, right, that occur around the world, not just in the United States, but around the world. And a significant portion of the world's population is very vulnerable to those. And for those of you that have experienced them, even sort of just been nearby them, they're very scary situations. They're scary to you, they're scary to your family, they're scary to the people that have to respond to them. And the goal of any response really is to save the lives of the people that get caught up in these. Do it very quickly, so as much time as we can save is very important in this. You don't want to spend months and months and months or years responding to a disaster, and we can talk more about that. And then from the government's perspective, you want to save money doing this too, not because they're not willing to pay the money to do it, and I'll show you some of the costs associated with these, but because if we are saving lives and time and money, we're just more efficient in our response, and that's really better for everybody. And the argument that we make at MIT and at the laboratory is that the technologies that are available worldwide, some of them, sensing technologies, analytics, a lot that got mentioned already, can do that. If we apply them appropriately, and if we build them appropriately, and if we deploy them to the right people appropriately, then we will save time and money, and I think most importantly, we'll save lives in these kinds of disasters. So that's the goal of the work that goes on at MIT and other places when it comes to disasters. I want to encourage you to ask questions as we go through this. Interrupt me if you have a question about something that's up there or a comment that I make. So please don't just sit until the end and ask questions. I'll take questions then. Perfect. Go ahead. The last pandemic was, I think, the 1918 flu. There's been several epidemics along the way, right, including things like bird flu, and there was one even a couple of years ago that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Those are naturally occurring pandemics, right? They occur naturally, but you can imagine man-made ones too, right? If we were attacked by somebody with a biological agent or something like that, that all falls into this category of very complex, very impactful things that can occur to the populations around the world. Okay, last year, 2017, was an awful year for disasters. It's the worst in recorded modern history for disasters, and we can talk about, I will on the next slide, a little bit about why that might be. 3 hurricanes, Category 4 or 5 hurricanes that impacted the United States and the Caribbean and really devastated those areas. Texas and Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, the Dominican Republic. Lots of places were impacted and still are feeling the effects of those things. It was a very bad wildfire season, not just in California, but in the Midwest too. And all of these things really are significant challenges for us to respond to one at a time, let alone having them happen 3 or 4 or 7 at a time in a year. That stresses all of the country's capability to effectively respond to these. And it's a lot of money to deal with these kinds of hurricanes. That's kind of amount of money that I can't even really fathom, right? $300 billion is a significant amount of money. And the country can't sort of stay on a path where we're paying that kind of money to build houses again, to fix the roads, to put the power lines back up. That's not something that is sustainable over a very long period of time. But what we're seeing is a trend in more and more disasters occurring over years. So I think this starts back in about 1980. And I'm just showing you here the disasters that cost $1 billion or more to respond to just inside the United States. But the map looks the plot looks very similar around the world as well. So more disasters per year, right? We're kind of up in the 7, 8, 9, 10 disasters a year. It's like 1 a month, right, that the country has to respond to. That's why it costs so much, and that's why it's such a big impact to our society. Go ahead.
You mentioned $300 billion to spend. Is this mostly national money, like government money? Is there anything that's coming from like individual states, or is it mostly federal?
Yep. So in fact, that number I showed, $300 billion, is just the federal government's contribution to it. So that is FEMA paying $300 billion to respond to those disasters. There's more money on top of that that comes from state and local governments too. Okay, this trend is concerning, right? We even if this plateaued out at 5 or 10 disasters a year, that's not something we can deal with. And again, we think technology is a way to, we're not going to change hurricanes, right? We're not going to stop them from coming. We're not going to stop an earthquake, and we're not going to stop a flood, but we need to be able to respond to them better. And technology is one way to think about doing that. Just so you know, a little bit of background, this is sort of the boring part of disaster response. The enterprise, the organizations that respond to this are super complex, right? So the federal government certainly responds when there is a large disaster, but as you were saying, there's a state response too. There's a local government, your town will respond as well. They get overwhelmed fairly quickly, and then they bring in the federal government. Federal government comes with the National Guard, so there's a military presence at these. That's not always a welcome thing. And then other places from around the world will help respond if we ask for their help. And then a very important part of this response is what they call non-government organizations, or NGOs. This places like the Red Cross, for example, is an NGO. They're some of the organizations oftentimes volunteer-based that have the biggest impact on response to a disaster. So this enterprise of organizations is large, and it's complex, and they're awful at talking to each other, and they're awful at sharing information, and they're awful at letting each other know what they're up to or what tomorrow's plans are. And that makes not only the disaster bad for the people, it makes the response sort of inefficient, right? And therefore, longer time, more money, and people die because of poor responses in these kinds of situations. The other thing that makes the response challenging is that it's incredibly manual, right? So I think you were just talking a little bit about autonomy before before I came in. And the response now is people with clipboards going out and finding people, or taking surveys, or flying in a helicopter and looking out the window for people on the roofs. It's driving around to see what streets are flooded. It is bringing all the information back on your clipboard, and then maybe putting it into something like Excel and emailing that thing around. That's an awful way to think about a response. And then do that at a scale of thousands of people, or an entire city, or half a state. And all of a sudden, you start to realize that this isn't a way that the country should be responding to disasters. And there's all kinds of improvements that can be made to that situation. Some of them like super obvious, and some of them will take many, many years to develop. And the laboratory and MIT are working sort of across that space. What can we do quickly in a disaster? But what can we do over the very long term in terms of research and development to move away from a situation like this, where everything is done by hand. It's incredibly labor intensive, and it's very expensive to do this as well. So you can think about maybe a whole different architecture, right, that has all kinds of different technology insertion points into it. We can think about what UAVs can do in these situations, better communication systems can do in these situations, autonomy can do in these situations, sensing before, during, and after a response are all important parts of a bigger, more advanced, more sophisticated way for the country to do it. And I think the challenge that I'm presenting to you guys today is to think about how to build this into a system, right? How do I get all the pieces to work together so that inefficiency in response becomes something very efficient and very routine and very automated, so that, again, we're faster, we're cheaper, and people's lives are saved. So I'm going to point out just a couple of technologies that the laboratory has been working on. I'm going to skip over this decision support piece, but I am happy to talk about it if people are interested. So I said that no one communicates very well together. There have been systems developed that are meant to be more like social apps, right, that people can communicate through, that integrate data, but not just throw it all in one place, but do analytics on that data to help make decisions, right? So a simple example of that is where do I begin my search and rescue? If I can scrape enough data from people who still have their cell phones and power and are sitting on their roof and saying, I'm in this location, I can get maps of the sort of stranded population density. And Facebook actually has a really cool application they're working on to do that, maybe make Facebook relevant again. So there's things like that are being worked on. The laboratory has some of those too. But I wanted to really talk about two other ones that I think are pretty cool and are very different in the kinds of technology that they use and the way that they impact disasters. One is an ability to measure where power is going out in real time or near real time. And you'd think we would be able to do that these days, but we absolutely cannot do that these days. And the other is the ability to map in very high resolution, very, very large areas, like an entire city, very quickly so that we can do damage assessments on that city and find people and find roads and figure out how to get in and out and where to drop off supplies and do all kinds of other really neat things. So I'm going to show you both of these kinds of things as we go forward here. Yeah.
About real-time outages, that there's no way for it to be done, at least currently.
Right.
Aren't there sort of systems, or at least some sort of map or any sort of data that represents when power is on throughout the city, like grids, houses, and things like that?
Right. So the short answer is no, there isn't a good way to do that. But let me come back to it because I know what you're thinking about, right? You can hop on the internet and find a map of your city and it will show where the power is on and off. And that map is made in a very unsophisticated way, although it looks very sophisticated when they show it to you. I'm bashing it a little bit, only because I like our idea better. But I will. Let me come back to that because you're going to see, I'm going to explain to you in the next section exactly how power outages are monitored now and a different way to do it. So don't let me skip by if I don't answer your question. Okay, these are the 4 phases of response to disaster, any natural disaster, any of those ones that I showed at the beginning. Mitigation is really just trying to prevent the impact. So building stronger buildings, getting your house up on stilts so that floods don't affect it, burying power lines so that the storms can't knock them over. So this is sort of the stuff that happens before a storm. Preparation, that's evacuation time, right? That's when people get out. That's when you put plywood on your house. That's that phase. Response is now after the storm. And this is often where search and rescue occurs in a disaster and the sort of very first phases of the days after the storm. And then recovery is the weeks and months and often years after a disaster that a community is trying to rebuild itself. And we would say that there is technology that applies in all of these places, way more than what I'm showing on one chart here. I'm going to show you a couple of things as we go through this. One is in this during the storm, so in between preparing and when we have to respond to a storm, the storm sort of hits in here, is the ability to monitor power and the state of power on very large scales. And I'll talk about why that's important to do as well. So it's annoying when the power goes out at your house, right? Or in your apartment, and you kind of lose everything. You have to reset your clock sometimes. That's super annoying. Some of you probably lived through or remember the 2015 snowstorm up here where power was out for days or a week. My house was out for a week. I had to go to work and take showers because I had to go some offsite one time that I felt bad about. That's kind of while it's bad for you, the least concerning part of power outages, right? The things that really matter are We lose communications. You can't talk to people very well anymore. Your cell phone battery is going to die pretty quickly, right? But think about first responder communications, right? Those are radios that they have to keep charged, or they're still landlines that they use to do that. Without power, they can't run those systems. People need fuel, not only for their car, but maybe you're lucky and you have a generator, right? You still have to get fuel for your generator. Guess what? The pumps at the gas station don't work anymore when the power goes out. So we can't get the fuel to people. So people leave and they start moving into shelters. That's a good thing. But we've now displaced entire populations, sometimes tens of thousands of people, just because the power is out. That's a significant challenge, not only the people, but keeping them safe and finding them a place to live. And feeding them, and all of that becomes an artifact of the power being out. And then maybe the most important thing is that our hospitals don't work, your doctor's offices don't work, the dialysis center that your friends have to go to don't work. That's a really scary part, right? It's really amazing to me how entrenched a power system is into our daily lives. It's entrenched as much as sort of a communication system as well. And they are both situations that when the power goes out, really, really bad things start to happen. You can make it a day or two, but if you start going 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 days, that is a situation that we are not able to deal with very well. So let me tell you what the power companies do now to keep track of the status of their power grid, right? They will do one of a couple things. One is if you're really, really lucky at your house, they've put some sort of sensor on the power meter that goes into your house. Oftentimes it's a radio that transmits if the power is on or off at that location. They really use those things for billing, right? That's the guy that drives around in the truck and gets the radio signal from your house that gives them the number that's on that dial. And they know how to bill you for the electricity you use. It'll also tell them if the power is on or off there. But that's still a person driving around in a truck. Some places, and I can tell you not New England, have things that are more sophisticated. They have cell phones built into those, and it will radio back if the power is on or off. That's fine. Also remember all the cell phone towers go down in an outage as well. And then the way that it's done in about 80% of the country is your mom or dad or friends get mad and they call the power company, right? And they say, the power's out at my house. And they say, thank you very much, we got your phone call, right? So that's this piece up here. About 80% of the reporting that comes in to a power company about their own power grid is from the customers that are buying power and telling them that the power is out. So no real good map is generated from that. That map, best case scenario, is 24 hours old when you see it. So in those in the maps that get generated on the web, when you're watching that, as a power outage goes out, that thing's very old, it's very stale. It's also probably pretty inaccurate. The power companies know that, the responders know that, but it is sort of the state of the art in terms of power sensing right now. The power companies take this data, they aggregate it all together, and they will give it to the emergency operations centers, the police, the fire, the FEMAs, the MEMAs, all the places that respond to disasters in sort of this 1 or 2 day latency time period. And again, once we get into 2, 3, 4, 5 days, things are starting to get really bad. If I'm getting that information days later, accurate information days later, that's not a very useful product. So there's a much, I would say, simpler way to do this that I thought was pretty interesting when we first started thinking about it. There are millions of IP addressable devices around the country. Everything in your house almost is IP addressable at this point. So the router at your house, set-top box that's sitting on top of your TV, your thermostat that's in your house for the most part, they all have unique IP addresses, or at least unique enough that if we ping those devices, not gather data from them, but just send a packet and say, are you alive or not alive? That's a proxy for whether the power is on. If the router's off, it will not respond to that proxy. Go ahead. The white So this scale is number of devices, right? And so where it's white, it's below 0, or we don't have information on that number. Not below 0, that's a bad thing. Negative IP addresses. We don't have information on what's in that area. That's a pretty remote part of the country out there. So I don't think we have good information on that. So we can ping devices pretty easily, especially now using sort of Amazon Web Services. We can send out packets and collect information on thousands and thousands of devices at a single time. And we can do that very quickly, right, in basically real time. Go ahead.
It says 60% of nodes have greater than 1 IP per household.
Yes.
How is it only 62%?
Yeah, because most of it's probably centered right about here. That is the number. Only 62% of the houses have more than 1 IP address, and so that means you'd have set-top box and a router, or a thermostat and a router, or something like that. And a lot of people just don't have a lot of different devices in their house. You guys are probably lucky that you have many devices in your house. Yeah, go ahead. Right. Yeah, excellent. So the question was, is it inaccurate? Because if you just shut off your router, it looks like your power's off, right? So that's an excellent question. So the way you get around that is I don't rely on 1 or 2 or 3 devices in a town or on a street to tell me that. I ping as many as I can. So I use statistics to get around the problem of somebody just shut their device off, or that somebody unplugged it that day. The other thing we see is that if you run your router on a generator, we can still communicate with it, right? And that doesn't mean you have power. It means you have your generator running on your house. So you just do it with numbers. You just do it enough times, and you can do the math to figure out how many you have to do to get around the sort of one-offs that would look like a false positive kind of thing. Okay, so really simple idea, right? We're just going to ask these devices, can you hear me, can you hear me, can you hear me? And they're going to respond, yep, I can hear you, I can hear you. And that is not a measure of power, but it's a proxy for power, right? And again, if I do the statistics right, I can get an accurate picture of where power is on and where power is off. This also scales with a geographic region, right? So I can do this at, I won't say we can do it sort of at the street level right now, but we can certainly do it at sort of the community level, the town level, city and state level. And again, very, very quickly in real time. And we'll say it's non-cooperative, right? We don't need you to call in. We don't need a cell phone communication. We don't need a person driving by in a truck. We can do all this without having the person who owns those devices have to participate in that conversation. So let me show you what some of this data looks like. So this is Hurricane Maria last year going through Florida. I'm going to show you Puerto Rico next, because that's a pretty interesting case too. So it came up here, hit the Keys, and then sort of barreled right through the center of Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas. And you can see, so red is power off and blue is power on. And we watched this storm go through Florida in real time and saw these colors change in real time. And you see we start adding up here, because if you remember, they didn't project the trajectory of this storm really well. It was supposed to sort of hit this coast and bounce off. They got it wrong. So we weren't scanning up here. We started turning that on and scanning up there. We saw this before the news reported power outages, before anybody knew what the power situation was across the entire state of Florida. And we gave this information to the National Guard, who used it to guide in the very early hours of that response their search and rescue efforts, right? So they use power as a proxy for the most damaged areas. Where the power goes out, that's where they want to send their resources to get people out of their houses, to get the hospitals back online, to get the dialysis centers running again, to get the Home Depot open, things like that. And we gave this kind of technology can give them that information faster than anybody else can. Go ahead.
So you're paying people's routers?
Yeah.
And trying to get a response?
Yeah.
Doesn't that seem like a little bit weird?
So you'll remember I said we don't collect any data from you, right? We're just asking, are you alive or not? So, yep, that's a really good question too. So it turns out that there are publicly available databases of IP addresses around the country, not around the world. But there are other people that collect all of that information about what your IP address is and what it's changing to over time, right? Sorry, say it again. We wait 1 hour to provide the data, and that's only, again, to get the numbers right on the statistics. So instead of 24 or 48 hours, we're down to an hour. When the nor'easters came through Massachusetts, 2018, early 2018, we had this system running in the Emergency Operations Center, and they were seeing it in real time. We just kept cautioning them on making decisions too quickly on it. Go ahead. A couple 100,000 at one time. And we do that through Amazon Web Services. We don't do it with a system that we have built. We just use the power of Amazon. Yeah.
If there was another maybe district within Florida which might have had a lot more hospitals or something like that, like how do you prioritize and factor in that some areas might, even though they might not have been hit necessarily as hard, but they still have a lot of facilities that are important for the state overall to have running? How do you prioritize those?
Yep, so I don't prioritize any of it, but the responders will prioritize that. So if they know that Dade County has a particular hospital that only has sort of this kind of operating room or something, they know that in advance and they'll be paying attention to that. That's what they call sort of critical infrastructure, and they will always respond to that kind of stuff fairly quickly.
Why hasn't anyone done anything like this before?
Yeah, actually, I don't know. It's like super simple, right? This is a no duh. This is one of these things that's like no duh. I think where it's a little creepy, I'll give you that, right? We're sort of pinging devices, but we're doing it as good internet citizens, right? We're not trying to scrape your data or track where you are. We're just talking to your router pretty quickly. And I don't know, but I can tell you there's lots of interest from the power companies once we start showing this. Let me show you one other thing. I want to keep moving a little bit here. Go to the next slide if I can. Nope. This is Puerto Rico. Anybody here from Puerto Rico? All right, good. That's good. Maria tore right through Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and a lot of other islands in the Caribbean. Category 4 or 5 when it was hitting those islands, like the worst situation you can have. And it got hit twice in like 2 weeks, 10 days. First, Irma came through, knocked out the power to about 80% of the island, and then we watch it recover. That's another cool thing you can do with this is watch the power come back on, right? And just about when they were good to go, Maria hit. And Maria devastated that island. It tore down everything. We've spent a lot of time there in the last 10 or 11 months, and it's still a very hard situation for that island. This is unprecedented. We've never measured anything like this before. We've never seen this kind of power grid failure before. I can tell you we kept scanning it, so I'm showing you a couple of months of data here. We kept scanning it. We still scan it to this day. And you get out here, and you really start to wonder what this data really means anymore, right? Because now people are I don't care about my router. I just want to go get food and water from somewhere. I might have replaced my routers at this point because they got flooded. Everything starts to change in terms of what our understanding is out here. But I think what I will say is that if we compare this to what the media was reporting on power outages and what the federal government was reporting on power outages, it's very similar in terms of trends, that it took several months to get up to sort of 10s or 20s or 30% of the island back online. All right, there's a bunch of questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, do you know the reason for the dips along the way to the recovery process?
These things? Yeah, I know exactly what those are. You'll remember in the news they would get on and say, okay, the power grid's coming back on, and they'd turn it on, and like a day later, everything would blow up again. These are when there were major transformer failures in the grid system, and it would just knock down the power again. We saw them happening in real time, like the next day, it would be reported in the news, but we saw them happen in the night.
I can't really see that well, but does the scale of the x-axis change, or is the recovery from Maria just that much slower?
It's that much slower. Yeah, that's a linear scale. Sorry. Should know better than put small font on this. That's September, middle of September to the middle of January, that time frame. I was in Puerto Rico last week, and there's still plenty of the parts of the island, especially in the middle of the island, without power.
When centers like dialysis machines fail, how do the population in the area account for that, especially because they need dialysis?
Yeah, so most hospitals, medical centers, things like that will have a generator that will get up and running at least the things that are most important to them. That's fine in the short term, right? It's not fine in sort of this time period, right? Now a generator breaks about here, right? And now I'm really stuck.
So where are you picking all the routers from? Like if the hub goes down, obviously you don't get any of the data.
Right. So that goes to the geographical resolution that we can get with the data. So we know if we can get to the hub and then outside of the hub. Sometimes it stops at the hub, right? And we know those IP addresses too. And if it stops there, then we assume everything that's serviced in that hub is also out. And again, we try to get around errors in that data with just statistics. How many different ways into a network can we ping? All right, let me click forward here. This isn't even the cool stuff. This is the cool stuff. Okay, so recovery from a storm, or the response and recovery of a storm, is sort of the things that now start to happen. So storm has gone through. We have a pretty dire situation, and we now need to find people and get infrastructure up and running again, and things like that. You'll remember Hurricane Harvey went into the Gulf and impacted Texas. It's one of the first places that we responded to with some neat technology to start mapping the damage that was occurring in that location. I can tell you it's occurring in Puerto Rico now too, so when I explain it to you, you can sort of get the sense of the scale. So Harvey bounced in and out of Texas a couple times in the Port Aransas and Houston area. It was primarily a flooding event, so this was the sort of 50 inches of rain in one location, so this is filling swimming pools and streets, right? And it covered an area that was 90,000 square miles in geographic space. That is huge. That's even huge for a hurricane, and a very population-dense part of the country. So what this meant was houses got destroyed, streets got flooded, cars got washed away, people got stranded in their houses, and the response by the government was to start going in boats and going in helicopters and pulling people out. What they didn't have is sort of a good situational awareness, right? They didn't know what was damaged, what was not damaged. Again, very much back to that manual process where we were just sending people in with their clipboards and their boats and their helicopters to find people. And what we had proposed at the time was that we could put some pretty cool sensors on an airplane. And some of the sensors that are built at the laboratory can look over very, very large areas, like city-scale areas, at one time. So we have, and I'll explain what they are, but we have LiDAR technology, so laser-based mapping technologies that can scan very large swaths of areas, tens to hundreds of square miles at a time. And we have very wide area imagery capabilities at the laboratory. And if we put them on a plane and we fly the plane over the area or fly it over the area many, many times, we can get really good maps of the situation, and we can get really good imagery of the situation at resolutions that you can't traditionally get from satellites or from other kinds of cameras that you might fly around. So we stuck those on not that cool plane that's there, but this plane, which is a little older, a little slower, and a little louder than the other one, but it's called a Twin Otter. And one of the first things that we put on it was a LiDAR or LADAR-based technology that is, so does anybody know what LiDARs do? Have people used those in the past? Stick them on robots all the time, map rooms and things like that, right? So photons from the plane go down, and they bounce back up, and we just time those photons, and that tells us how far it is to any distance, right? Pretty simple idea. You just do it with a whole lot of photons and a really, really sensitive detector. And then you can create three-dimensional maps of the space below you. And you can do it on a plane like this, and you can process some of it on the plane, and you can process some of it on the ground. So here's a neighborhood in Port Aransas, Texas, that we named Windmill Bluff after one of the roads in that street. I show it only because it's an easy sort of shape to see. This is that 50 inches of rain. There's a bayou that runs through here. This thing went over its banks quickly. You don't even see the end of it, right? So this is now filled the first floor of your house with water. Everything is destroyed in that situation. Here's the LiDAR map of that same thing, colored by height. So blue or black is ground level, and then reds are higher. So there's a hill in that neighborhood. The blue is the streets. You can see the houses. You can see the trees. You can see, if you really dig in, you can see the cars that were left behind after those flood waters receded. One of the questions that is most important to answer is how much debris is created in a situation like this, because the government pays to have that debris removed. So when your house gets flooded, you go home and you start mucking out your house, right? You throw the couch out, you throw the refrigerator out, you cut the sheetrock out, you pull everything out of this that got flooded, and you throw it on the curb. And it's the government's job to come around and get that. In Harvey, that was a $2 billion bill to remove that debris. $500 million of that money was just to do how much debris is out there and to pay auditors to make sure that the government wasn't getting ripped off for the volume of debris that was being used in this situation. So $500 million was just spent to do that. We can fly over this thing in a night, and because we have a three-dimensional map of the area, calculate the volume of debris that people are putting out on their curbs, and we can tell the government that's what you should pay for, right? No more, no less than that. So that's exactly what we did in this data. What's cool about this thing is we can digitally remove stuff like houses and trees and other features that are not debris from the data. We can put the road map network on the data, and we can make up rules that say anything within 30 feet of the curb of the road we'll call debris, right? And that's kind of the rule that FEMA uses and tells people when they're mucking their houses out. And we can remove everything else from the data except what looks like debris piles sitting around people's houses. And we can calculate the volume of that debris in that neighborhood. So we came up with 3,850 cubic yards of debris. The Army Corps of Engineers also does this. They drive around in a truck and go 10 cubic yards or so. They're actually pretty good at it. That's their number, 3,600 cubic yards. So pretty close. You know, we would argue our number is better than their number because it's really metrical, right? We measured that debris that's in that situation. So then we can calculate the cost to remove that debris. So kind of a silly thing, right? We're measuring how much trash people are throwing out of their houses, but it's to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. The really neat thing about these technologies is that I showed you a neighborhood. We can do this over, that's like a city scale swath of land. So in a flight or two on this plane, we can tell you all the debris. That's just debris that people have moved outside of their houses on a scale that would take months and months and months for the Army Corps of Engineers to drive around and do. The other neat thing about LiDAR data sets is that that's not the only thing in there. It's one data set that contains all kinds of information. We can look at damage. Here's different houses and in a different neighborhood. One has a hole in the roof. We see that hole in the roof. One has sort of major structural damage and one is just flattened to the ground, right? So now your insurance company can have this information and they can decide who to pay back very quickly. Again, using a pretty unique sensor, but a technology that a response community never had before. We can look at critical infrastructure. We can see power lines, if they're up or down in those situations. We're actually seeing the steam coming out of a power plant generator or a power generator over here. So we knew that power generator was on, and it was one that you could go back to and start tapping into the power and get that part of the community up and running again. We can do structural integrity. So what that really means is if you know the building plans and you knew how high the water flooded, you can sort of map it out in these 3 dimensions and say, yeah, the air handling units were safe in that situation. They shouldn't be damaged. So let's go back there and turn that thing on. And you can do it all remotely, right? We don't have to send people out there. It's all just in this data set. That's a pretty game-changing way of thinking about doing response to different disasters. And I don't care if it's a flood or a tornado or a hurricane or a wildfire, the same kind of technology can be used to respond to many of those kinds of situations. Now, I don't have it in here, but I will tell you that we've done the same thing in Puerto Rico. We mapped in 27 days the entire island, which is 3,500 square miles, down to 25 centimeter resolution. It's one of the best mapped places in the world right now. And the reason we did that is to A, monitor the recovery that has occurred, but if they get hit with another storm this season, we're in hurricane season right now. We know what that island looks like now, and we'll go back and scan it again if a storm comes, and then we can very quickly do change detection on that data and say, these roads are broken, those power lines are down, those cell phone towers are down, these are up, you should move people here, that hospital's broken, that school's got missing a roof. We can do all that very, very quickly over the entire island, not just in one part of the island. Okay, so I will stop there and just tell you that technology has a really big role to play in disaster response and in humanitarian crises around the world. I didn't really talk about that part. And the invention that can occur in that space, because we're not so good at doing it right now, is really ripe for exploitation. And I think the challenge to you guys is think about the things you're interested in, think about the fields you want to go into, and think about how some of that work can save lives in these situations, right? I don't care if it's medicine or optics or mechanical engineering, all of those are skills that we apply in these situations, and we see real differences, right? I mean, when we can tell people this is where you should start your search and rescue, because that's likely the most damaged part of the city. That's a pretty good feeling, right? That we can do that and help people make those kinds of decisions using technologies that they never had before. Okay, so I will stop there, and I'm happy to, I don't know what kind of time we're at. I wasn't paying attention.
Plenty of time for questions. Thank
Okay,
you.
so fire away. There's a lot I blew by.
How much does this cost? Like the paying the IP addresses, the flyovers, and the calculations for the debris?
Yeah, so IP addresses is really, really cheap. It costs almost nothing, right? If we have a S3 account on Amazon Web Services, we just use that. Honestly, the time is making pretty charts out of that data than anything else. The airplane, okay, that guy's expensive, right? But it's an already built technology. It's not like you're trying to invent that thing right now. So you know, in the scheme of things, well, maybe I can do it this way relatively. Puerto Rico was given $87 billion to recover from Maria. The cost of scanning that island one time was about $2 million. So it's like a rounding error in the 87 billion, right? So on the scale of disaster response, it's super cheap.
The $2 million for like a 20-something day.
Right. It's expensive to fly a plane. Did I get your question before?
Yeah, you
All right, good.
For structural integrity,
You say that, I don't know if I understood right, but are you saying that you compare like differences in like the structure that's supposed to be there versus what happens after the disaster strikes?
Yep, that's one way to think about it. So if you're a manager at a power plant, you know where every piece of equipment is in that power plant, right? And you usually have a drawing or a map of what that is. And if you're telling me that your air handling units were at 64 inches above the ground and we can measure the flood inundation at 50 inches above the ground, then we know that that equipment's probably okay, and we didn't need to send somebody out there to do it. So it's a little bit of a combination of, if I know the infrastructure, I can make an assessment of what's damaged or not, or if something's like altogether missing, right, we'll see that in the data too. What else? Go ahead.
Lincoln Labs works a lot with natural disaster response and things like that. Do you know if they do any work with like main events, like for example, oil spills?
So yeah, and in fact, the Gulf oil spill 2015, 13, 15, whatever, 2000 something, the lab did go to that, and they brought some of these technologies. I didn't show them here, but those very wide area imaging technologies, they were brought there to look for the oil slicks on very big scales. And there's a lot of work on campus too with remediation and things like that for those kinds of events. Yeah, we try to help where we can, right?
Aaron, how can automated systems help with that for natural disasters?
So the simplest way to think about automation from a disaster response perspective is, it's not simple in implementation. The amount of data that they gather, imagery, LiDAR data, social media data, reports that come in from the people that operate in the field, phone calls that come in from the survivors. The response community probably gets through like a fraction of a percent of that data to make any decisions around. So automating the ability to interpret or analyze or get information out of that data holistically, all of it, right? That's, whoever figures that one out that's a big game changer. And it can start with something simple like automated image analysis, right? So let me fly over a city that just got hit with a hurricane. Let's take Katrina, for example, right? There were people on the roofs of their houses for days waiting to be rescued, and it's only because we're flying around looking for them, right? Had we just taken an image of the city and automated finding people on the roof, we would have known exactly where those people were very quickly, and we could have deployed people to go get them very quickly. So there's that kind of automation, that you know, data analysis automation.
Yeah, so data analysis is really important, but also like how would you like use automation to do the preparation work? Like right now they send out like emergency alerts or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah, sure. I think those are good ideas, and I think those are, you know, interesting ideas to start exploring and thinking about. I don't know if I have like what's the silver bullet answer in that question, but I do believe that any way that we can reduce the workload on the situation before, during, and after is really a game changer for a response.
Questions. After using $2 million to scan over Puerto Rico and find out on the cameras that the DIA has taken, how much money did you evaluate the recovery cost?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I don't think I have a number for you. But let me just try to give you some data, because I think retrospectively we'll be able to answer that question. We saved this much money. Let me try this. They're expecting that data will save a person year of work in recovering Puerto Rico. And then let me tell you that the federal government is paying $30 million a month in hotel rooms to staff people down there, right? So if I save a month, and I just save hotel rooms, I save $30 million, right? So it's probably in the hundreds of millions or $1 billion kind of scale that kind of technology can save in the response phase.
So my second question.
Yep.
What is when I look at the BWSI logo, I see like a laboratory on it. So like I would just want to know it's the why it is there.
Why there's laboratories there? To do really neat things like this. So Lincoln Laboratory is part of MIT, right? And it is taking advanced technologies and applying them in real world situations, right? This is just one example of that. It's a pretty unique and interesting laboratory to work at.
The BWSI is one of the programs of BWorks. BWorks is an MIT initiative between MIT School of Engineering and Lincoln Laboratory. So that's why you see BWSI, you see Lincoln Laboratory.
Good. All right, back of the room. There were some. Go ahead.
Going back a little bit, I know you guys are first thing I do is I pull out my phone and they have that free bail power. How do you account for the cell phone usage when doing these applications?
How do we have our cell phones in that power map? We don't use them. Yeah. Yeah, we don't ping cell phones. We just ping things that would be plugged into the wall. Yeah.
So I remember reading during the recovery process about how these people found equipment that was just not being used on the Puerto Rican island.
Yeah.
Would your technology, well, first of all, was it implemented to try to find that, or would your technology be able to prevent that from happening in later?
Yeah, so good question. I think, so the stories that I have heard, and I wasn't there for the early phase of the response, but supplies were being brought in, or there were warehouses around the island, and the stuff wasn't sort of leaving the docks or leaving the warehouse and getting to where it needed to go. One of the reasons that happened is the trafficability of the roads. They were washed out or destroyed, or people didn't know if they could get trucks in and out of an area. And in that sense, we can do trafficability studies, what's open, what's blocked, what's a good way in or out of a location, easily in that data. So if we have the data shortly after a storm, then maybe we can do better logistics planning, right? How do we get materials around the island? Or if I know there's a bunch of generators over at that school, and I want to bring them over to that hospital, can I plot a route that does that efficiently, right? So I think you could do it. It won't necessarily find the generators, right? But if you know where stuff is, we can do a better job of planning how to use it.
Have you guys ever encountered any major inaccuracies in a particular measurement in a situation?
For the 3D mapping?
For any of the technologies you kind of discussed?
So the LiDAR technology has been developed over about the last 20 years, and we've done a lot of sort of quality control on that data in that time, and a lot of understanding of how accurate that data is. And I can tell you it's very accurate. We also do a bunch of calibration flights before and after, measuring known things, right? So we know what its performance is before it leaves. In the power sensing, again, because the data collection on power sensing is so bad, it's hard to validate that, but there have been a couple situations. Hurricane Matthew that went through Florida and the Carolinas a few years ago. The power companies turned over their data to us retrospectively, and it matches actually very well those color changes that occurred. So it's not perfect validation, but it's better than nothing. So we try really hard to make sure that what we're doing is very accurate, more accurate than any other way.
Are you getting a data set of important buildings in the area, or when you're cleaning them, trying to determine what power is?
Yeah. So who wants a really cool idea to then go start a company with? All right, so build a little device that doesn't cost anything. Give it to every Home Depot, every Walmart, every hospital, every school. Fix the IP address and make it a cooperative situation, right? No, I don't want to ping your house randomly and do the statistics to get it right. I just want to put a sensor on every single telephone pole out there, and I want to ping it because I can, and I want to tell you where the power lines are down. You would use that year-round. That doesn't take a disaster, right? I would know if a tree fell on somebody's power line faster than they would get on the phone and call me, right? That's, go make a bunch of money off that idea
I think
right
we've
there.
got time for a couple more questions. I know over here, a couple of these guys had questions.
So better sensing, right? If we're way up in space, we can see a lot more area-wise very, very quickly. There's all kinds of challenges with that, right? But yeah, I mean, we use satellite imagery now heavily in these responses. So better sensors on satellites, better sensors on spacecraft would be great, especially if they're sort of tuned to this situation. One more, go ahead.
So what kind of systems do you guys use to pinpoint where taking damage in like the grid infrastructure?
So we don't, we don't report back our data to the power company yet. We let them do their own surveys on that. And it's partially because we want to get the sort of accuracy of the data right. We don't want to send them off in places that they shouldn't be going to fix something if it's not broken. I think we'll see that use in time, right, where we're telling people how to repair their grid based on this kind of information.
One more question, Bob.
So will there be a BWSI project next year on this topic?
Is there any other answer but yes?
Yeah.
Very good.
All right, thank you. Let's give John another hand here for showing up.